Hey guys, today we're going to be taking an in-depth look at the RTX 5070 Ti at 1440p. The version of the card that we're using is the ASUS TUF Gaming. It is an OC model that retails for $1,000, so it is one of the pricier 5070 Ti's. This card came out back in January, so it's about 6 months old at this point. It has 16 gigabytes of GDDR7 video memory. We're playing on the latest NVIDIA drivers and pairing with a 9800X 3D as well as 64 gigabytes of DDR5. And just to clarify, the reason that we are using 1440p as our benchmark here is that both the 5070 as well as the 5070 Ti actually use 1440p. NVIDIA uses themselves 1440p as the benchmark here. So the Ti version of the 5070 being like the premier version of the card that, we should be able to get max settings, 1440p, great performance. So we'll see if that holds true. Let's hop in. All right, we're starting off here in Assassin's Creed Shadows. We're playing at 1440p at native resolution using TAA for our anti-aliasing, which, 1440p is kind of maybe in that in-between zone, in my opinion, where 1080p TAA doesn't look great. 4K TAA looks totally acceptable. And 1440p is kind of right in the middle. I think it could definitely, if we were to enable something like DLAA with DLSS playing here, it would certainly be a stronger looking picture. However, there would be a major performance hit. So we're playing just at native TAA here, which does look okay. We're playing on high settings with Ray Trace Global Illumination set to diffuse everywhere, which is really the important setting. Diffusing hideout only does result in a pretty poor looking image, and we're playing at high settings, which, these are the high preset. We can come in here and independently change everything, but really, my opinion, we want, high or very high settings and native 1440p. That's my personal opinion of what a 1440p card is just a card that can play at native 1440p, high max settings, somewhere in that range, and get 60 FPS consistently. And luckily, that is the case. Now, Assassin's Creed Shadows, it's not the most demanding game ever, but it actually is up there in terms of how demanding games are nowadays. And we're getting really solid performance, around 80 FPS at native 1440p. Now, we could crank settings and probably drag that down a little bit, but really, in my opinion, this looks great. This is one of those games that 60 FPS is just about where you want to be at. Below 60 doesn't feel good, but really going like far above 60 also, you kind of stop getting really any sort of super meaningful like performance or experience differences. So around 76 on our average, we'll kind of, I guess I was going to say enter into some combat, but I guess that guy didn't really put up much of a fight there. But yeah, really solid performance here, even in a city. These scenes will vary, like if we climb a structure, they'll go up a bit. If we go into some more intensive scenes, they may drop a little bit. But the game looks great here, and we're getting a solid FPS. Not necessarily like a super high FPS or anything like that, but really no complaints whatsoever. Really consistent frame time, 66% or 66 FPS on our 1% low. Really happy with the performance here. And let's just make sure that that holds true as we kind of go into a little bit of combat. Now, the combat in a game like this, it's not really very demanding anyways. It's not like the most, fast form version of combat. It's like we are really, having like any crazy effects going on in combat. There are like smoke bombs and things like that that might dip your FPS slightly, but in general here, pretty solid. Now, of course, NVIDIA, part of the appeal of NVIDIA is the great upscaling. So let's just go for DLSS set to quality. Now, this should do a few things. This will both give us a slight FPS increase, which we can see pretty evident right away. Now we're into the 90s, but really, it also looks really great. It now is using DLSS for our anti-aliasing solution. So some of the TAA weirdness where things were a bit blurry, we're no longer having to deal with that. We get arguably a sharper image. You can also come in and adjust the sharpening, but really solid performance here. Now, this game does not support the transformer model by default. However, it can be manually injected, and it also does not support multi-frame generation. So we can turn on frame generation here. And this will see our FPS shoot up into the 150 range. However, there is no support for adding multiple frames, you know, the feature that the 50 series cards really tout. But yeah, in my opinion, you know, the game looks great here on the high settings. You could bump it up. As you can see, we have like a good bit of wiggle room where we could bump up the card more. But in my opinion, this is a pass at 1440p. We're able to play native at 60 FPS, introduce a bit of upscaling, get a bit more performance. And if we were okay with even introducing some frame generation, really a game like this feels totally acceptable in my opinion. It feels great. Now we're getting 150 FPS. So if you had a 144 hertz 1440p monitor, you'd be able to have a really solid experience on this title. All right, next up here we have a new game, for me at least, not one that I've benchmarked independently on this channel, and that is Expedition 33. And we're going to be playing on the high preset using TSR for our anti-aliasing. It doesn't have a native TAA mode, so TSR is the the cheapest form of anti-aliasing we have. We also do have DLAA that we could enable. However, we're just going to go with TSR at Epic, or we can do custom and just make sure our resolution scales at 100 is all that really matters here. So we're playing 1440p at high native settings. Now, this game, I imagine, I haven't really done a super deep dive on it, aside from really just kind of playing through the game on my own, but I imagine it's actually probably pretty difficult to benchmark, just given the fact that there are so many different scenes, and they vary pretty wildly. This is kind of our little overworld area, and as you can see, we're getting totally solid FPS, sitting right around 85, running around. There's a few different scenes that you may see. There's obviously battle scenes, and then there is another environment that you can go into, kind of like a going into these different environments here. So we'll see. We'll hop into one area here, try to get into a bit of combat, and just see what kind of performance we can expect. But at least in the overworld running around here, excuse me, it looks great, and we're getting above 60 FPS. So definitely real solid performance here. A game like this is certainly not a game that you need super high FPS, but you do need high enough FPS in combat to where you can actually, you know, perform your dodges and parries effectively. So that's really where it's going to be more important. And this is actually inside one of these areas. So like I said, I imagine that this will vary pretty wildly depending on what particular area that you are in. This one seems to be pretty small. It's actually the first time I've been here. Well, let's see if we can get into a bit of combat. But yeah, definitely a better performance here in a more enclosed area, sitting right about 100 FPS. And the game looks great. You know, TSR at native, it's not as good as DLAA, but it is better than TAA. So it's kind of, you know, in that middle ground. Definitely a good enough 1440p image, in my opinion. And in a combat environment like this, pretty much still really solid performance, it's looking like. Definitely more than enough to perform any sort of dodges or counters or anything like that, as I miss a dodge and counter there. But yeah, definitely real solid FPS here. At native, really no need for any sort of really major anti-aliasing or upscaling solution. You are getting, even in combat encounters, a pretty solid FPS. Let's try to go for a slightly weaker enemy to see if we can get a more in-depth experience here. So yeah, as you can see, we are able to like perform our counters just fine. Definitely not holding us back now. 90 FPS, of course, shouldn't be much of a surprise, but definitely you know, happy with the performance here. Now, just to see what kind of performance we can get if we were to use DLSS quality, which really, like 9 times out of 10, I would say just go for DLSS quality in most situations, especially like a single player game like this. You're going to be getting a really solid looking picture, and as you can see, this gives us a major boost to our FPS, now bringing us all the way up to 150. And really, even in a combat encounter here, you can see still getting really solid FPS. Does, you know, dip ever so slightly down to like the 140s, but really, you know, no problem whatsoever, doing everything that you need to do. Game looks and feels incredibly smooth. Definitely a pass, I would say, for this game at 1440p. Kind of similar to Assassin's Creed Shadows, you can play at native and get, you know, solid FPS, but really a game like this, which is a pretty demanding game, it's an Unreal Engine 5 game, you're better off just using a little bit of upscaling, giving yourself a bit more FPS, and really on an NVIDIA card with DLSS, it's going to result in a much better looking picture anyways. All right, next up here we have a bit of a layup, Counter-Strike 2. We're playing at full screen 1440p, and we're going to be on the low preset. Now, on the low preset here, it automatically enables FSR. I'm actually going to turn this off just to see, you know, what it can do on just low at native resolution here. Now, this particular game, and really a lot of competitive games, when you get down to low settings, really what you begin testing much more than the GPU performance is really CPU performance. But I can't count the number of comments that I've gotten when I benchmark more competitive like games like Fortnite, Marvel Rivals, especially Counter-Strike 2, just saying basically that no one plays on anything other than low settings. So I'm going to check out high settings too. But let's just see what it can push at low settings with the 9800X 3D. So this is pretty much, best case scenario here. And as you can see, really no problem whatsoever rendering this game at low settings. We are in a position where we are CPU bound, as you can see. That's evident by the fact that our GPU is only reaching like typically around 80% utilization. So you could get better performance than this if we theoretically had a more powerful CPU, but of course, the 9800X 3D is essentially the top of the line CPU. I know the 9950X 3D is technically a better CPU. However, in gaming circumstances, that's not always the case. But obviously here at 1440p low settings, really no complaints whatsoever. You could cap the frame rate at 400 or something like that to get a more consistent experience. But just to see what we can get at native here without, capping or really looking at anything, just full-throated, just seeing what the card can do. It's around 600 on our average, 1% lows down in the 200s. So really, really great performance here. And now just to see what the high settings look like, that does increase a lot of our settings by quite a bit, still playing at native resolution here at 1440p. And as you can see on high settings, really not a super meaningful difference. Did drop our FPS where we were right around the 600s. Now we're in the 400s. Super competitive players who are really, really serious about Counter-Strike, this may be important to them, the FPS difference between high and low settings. For me, it's not necessarily, the other thing with low settings that you have to keep in mind is that it's just like a more simplistic looking image. So there could be another argument to be made for a competitive advantage, just that there's kind of just less visual clutter on the screen. But really, regardless of the settings that you choose here, you're going to be getting really solid performance. Now, it is worth mentioning that, on a NVIDIA card that you would like to potentially be using DLSS, just keep in mind this game does not have any sort of DLSS support. The upscaling is all handled through FSR. So if you did want to increase your FPS even more, and, you would also get lower latency, as I'm frying all these guys right now, but okay, I spoke too soon. You would be confined to FSR. So there are some arguments to be made for FSR as well. Probably the reason that the low settings throw on FSR by default is for those competitive advantages as well. So, yeah, really solid FPS here. Counter-Strike 2 can be run on integrated graphics as well as much, much weaker GPUs. So not a huge surprise that a $1,000 GPU paired with a, $500 CPU is going to get you a super competitive experience here. But if you're curious, that is true. Around 600 FPS on low and right around 440 looks like where we're averaging out here on high settings. So really, really solid experience. All right, next up here we have Cyberpunk 2077. Now, this game has so many different settings that really it could probably be its own video going through everything, but I just want to show two settings here. So I want to show what the game looks like without ray tracing basically, and then turn on ray tracing. So we're just going to go for the ultra preset, resolution scaling off, which just turns this to custom, which annoys me, but that's besides the fact. So this is just ultra settings here, turn off motion blur at native resolution 1440p. So really, this is just to show that, in my opinion, this game still looks really great without ray tracing. I kind of feel like I repeat the same points every time I benchmark this game, but, really, if I'm being honest, ray tracing is nice, and I actually do expect us to get a real playable FPS with ray tracing on, but really, even at ultra settings, if you value a high FPS and you don't want to use super aggressive upscaling or upscaling of any kind, especially if you're playing on other cards other than NVIDIA, that doesn't really have the best upscaling options, there's no FSR 4 in this game, is what I'm trying to say. So if you're on an AMD card, I wouldn't feel bad about not having ray tracing. The game still looks good. There's still a lot of really great lighting and shadows, even without the ray tracing. It just kind of amps it up a little bit when we do enable that ray tracing. So as you can see here, we're getting right about 120 FPS. Really solid experience here. Not really any sort of meaningful dips. Of course, the combat in this game is really not the most demanding thing anyways. Really driving around the city and things like that, that's really where you're going to see your FPS dip the most. But if you're just looking for a solid FPS and a good experience here at 1440p, playing on ultra at native resolution, you're going to be getting that. Really no questions asked. Now, I guess my question is, what's the ray tracing performance like? So let's just crank our ray trace settings going all the way to ultra. We'll leave off overdrive, which is the path tracing option, which is obviously incredibly demanding. So let's just see how it handles ray trace ultra at native resolution. And again, the only thing I'm going to come in here and adjust is just our motion blur. Now here at 1440p native ray tracing ultra, we are getting around 60 FPS right now. However, like I said, driving around the city is really the most intensive thing that you'll find yourself doing. So walking around here, getting around 60, that does probably mean that when we start driving, we are going to be getting a tad bit under 60 FPS, but maybe not. Well, it looks like we're just slightly under 60 FPS most of the time here. So hovering really close to 60 FPS at native resolution here at 1440p using ray tracing ultra. Really solid results. This is a game that's kind of gone through some iterations, and at the time of release was incredibly not well optimized, and then since then has become far better optimized. But yeah, ray tracing ultra at native resolution here without any sort of upscaling, you're going to be getting around 60 FPS. Feels like a relatively solid experience. 1% lows at 48. Our video memory is sitting at right around 11 gigabytes, so definitely happy to have 16. Not really a major issue on the video memory front. But of course, the other great thing about this game is that it does have all of these nice upscaling options. So let's go ahead and we'll throw on transformer model for super resolution, and let's just put it to quality. I'm not going to mess with frame generation in this particular video. Again, if there's a lot of interest for it, maybe I'll do a specific Cyberpunk video. But you can see just turning on that quality option, which especially on the transformer model looks absolutely great. Really, in a lot of cases looks better than native resolution. When we turn resolution scaling off in this game, it reverts to just using TAA for our anti-aliasing. So there's actually no way to play with anti-aliasing completely off in this title. It seems to be kind of a common thing in a lot of games. But yeah, as you can see, just throwing on just transformer at quality, you get all of the nice bells and whistles of ray tracing aside from the path tracing, and really getting a really solid looking picture. Pretty much, I would even argue that this looks better than native with TAA. So yeah, the game looks great. Really, whatever you throw it on, it looks good. The only thing that can really mess it up is if you go for super aggressive upscaling, frame generation coming from a low FPS. But the card 1440p can handle everything you throw at it aside from path tracing at native resolution, and keep right around 60, and then has all of these really great upscaling options. As you can see, sitting right around 90, driving around, and if we restart counting, now walking around, now we're getting, around 100. So, really no room to complain here. In my opinion, this is an incredibly solid experience. A bit of combat here drops us down a little bit into the 90s. Not super terrible, of course, still holding well above 60. Even our 1% low is above 60 FPS. We are also, have a lot of effects going on here, but really solid experience, in my opinion. I would not be upset about playing on these settings really whatsoever. I think the transform model, especially in Cyberpunk, looks really great. This does just seem to be kind of a pretty intensive scene, so a lot of enemies and obviously a lot of effects going on here, but still hanging in there, averaging at around 90. Definitely a really strong experience in Cyberpunk here on the 5070 Ti. Next up here we have Doom: The Dark Ages. This is another game that I have done a more extensive video on, so if you're interested in checking that out, please do. And for this one, we're just going to be playing at 1440p, Ultra Nightmare, no path tracing, and at native TAA. Now, this is a really well-performing game, as you can see. I mean, native resolution here looks absolutely incredible, even with TAA. The upscaling options do work really well, and it does have preset K built in by default, which is certainly nice that we can just, throw that on without any work really being done. But getting around 100 FPS here, this little run, I've done this countless times on different GPUs, but there is a more intensive scene coming up here in a moment. But 100 FPS here is a really good place to start, using about 10 gigabytes or so of video memory. Jumping into our intensive area here, it does see our FPS drop slightly, but still hanging on well above 60 FPS here at ultra nightmare settings. Now I have done a video, with the 5090 looking at path tracing on this particular title, and basically my takeaway for path tracing, especially on this game, it's more noticeable on Cyberpunk, but on this game, the path tracing, in my opinion, I don't know if it's the implementation or just the fact that the game already looks really solid, but really, my opinion, unless you're on like a super high-end card, like I'm talking 5090, and even 5090, it's a, it's questionable depending on the resolution whether or not it's worth it. I would probably leave the path tracing alone. I don't think it's really worth the performance that you are going to be taking. For my testing, I believe would be going down, like in this instance, would be going down from around 80 to like all the way down to like 25 FPS or something like that. So definitely not what I would consider to be worth it. But here at native 1440p, highest settings aside from that path tracing, getting 90 FPS average, and that's in this intensive scene. As you can see, when we kind of hop out here, you'll see our FPS shoot up now into like the 110, 120 neighborhood. So yeah, definitely a really solid experience here in Doom. This is a great looking game and a really well performing game. It was a really fun game to benchmark at the time of release. And this card is obviously, the NVIDIA cards in general were part of the marketing engine for this game. Was actually given away at the time of this game's launch. The game was given away with the purchase of NVIDIA GPUs, so it shouldn't be a major surprise that the 5070 Ti, which kind of sits right in the middle or so, maybe like towards slightly more towards the higher end of their product line, shouldn't be a major surprise that it handles the game absolutely flawlessly at the expected resolution. Without the need for any upscaling, but I will throw on a bit of upscaling just to kind of show what you can bring that up to, especially with preset K, without really much in the terms of, visual clarity loss or anything like that. So we're just going to come in here and switch over to DLSS, set to quality, no frame generation. This is just DLSS quality. So this is going to use that transformer model by default, and now where we were getting, right about 90 or so in these indoor areas, now we're pretty lock solid at about 120 FPS. So if you're playing on a higher refresh rate monitor, 144, or connecting to, I know there's a lot of, TVs that are at 120 hertz, you'd be able to have a really, really solid experience here. So definitely happy with the performance here. All right, next up here we have Oblivion Remastered. Now, this is a bit more of a demanding title, so 1440p, we're going to start off at native resolution here on ultra settings, software RT set to low, and we're just using TAA for the anti-aliasing. And like I said, I've done a more in-depth video on this game. It has actually seemingly gotten some updates that makes it actually a bit smoother, believe it or not, but yeah, still, 1440p ultra on this particular GPU seems to be out of the wheelhouse of the card, at least at native resolution here. I mean, 50 FPS, I don't know, it's just not a good place to be at, really. I mean, it's playable, I mean, this game on old consoles was 30 FPS. I put probably like 200 hours into it at the time of release. But, nowadays, especially playing on mouse and keyboard, you want higher FPS, so 50 is not really going to cut it for what I'm looking for. So let's just go ahead and we'll throw on DLSS set to quality right here. And quality DLSS does seem to push us over the hump and get us into a much, much better place. So, using these particular settings, getting 85 FPS on our average here, definitely a really, really solid experience in my personal opinion. And, there are still some things like, some of these fuzzies, like the more fine details, which this game does have a ton of, in leaves and grass and a lot of foliage. Some of it's just like super finely rendered, and some of that stuff doesn't agree even with good upscaling or only using quality. Some of it doesn't really agree with that upscaling super well, but in general, you can come here, play, now you're getting, where you were getting 50, getting around 90 or so. Definitely a much, much smoother experience. I wouldn't necessarily say that this game is a pass at ultra settings when you're talking about a 1440p card, because I do want at least 60 FPS. But it's close enough that just a little bit of upscaling can push you past 60, actually much, much past 60. This particular run also does go from a slightly more demanding area outside of a city into a slightly less demanding area just out here more in the open. So around 100 FPS with, with a bit of upscaling. But let's see if we can play at native resolution, at least on high settings. So we're going to go back, turn off our upscaling, just go back to TAA and let's switch over to the high preset here. And let's just make sure our resolution scale is set to 100. I hate how this game adjusts my resolution scale. And yes, on the high preset as opposed to ultra, it does push us well beyond 60 FPS. So definitely a much smoother experience here. So, you know, it's up to you whether or not you would consider this a pass, I guess. You know, I would like to get 60 FPS on maxed out settings, but just going down to high and getting well above 60 FPS, definitely a really nice experience. I don't really think in this particular game there's a huge difference between high and ultra settings, so I would probably, if I was going to play at native resolution here, I'd probably just stick to the high settings and get there in this way, as opposed to going for ultra and having to use, you know, quality upscaling to get there in a different way. This looks really sharp, and especially due to the fact that like these more fine details, blades of grass, things like that, that they don't really love the upscaling technology just in general. It's not really the fault of DLSS. It's just the fact that like there's so many fine details off in the distance, leaves, things like that that are rendering in. I would probably prefer to play high and stick with native and get that high FPS this way. All right, next up here we have Fortnite. Playing at 1440p full screen, and once again sticking with the low settings here. The only thing I adjusted was just changing our anti-aliasing just over to TAA. So these are low native settings. We are not on performance mode. We are using DirectX 12. So these are just the lowest possible DirectX 12 settings. Which, you know, guys, let me know, for competitive games, is this better to benchmark the low settings as opposed to like the higher settings or a more medium setting? Let me know. That's really the feedback that I've gotten, so I do want to kind of just test that. But yeah, just going for 1440p low settings at native resolution using TAA for our anti-aliasing. All right, so here at native 1440p low, once again, getting real solid FPS. You know, the only issue here is that we are seeing, looks like we're maybe getting some shader compilation, potentially. It's kind of strange that our CPU utilization is so high, but we'll see if that empties down or kind of lowers down a little bit. But yeah, the only issue here is really the 1% lows aren't great. Let's try recounting our FPS, see if that kind of fixes it or if that is actually the case. Yeah, 1% lows are not amazing, but our general FPS is close to 400. The game looks okay, you know, at low settings at DirectX 12, the game looks okay. It's not, you know, terrible. The game has a cartoony art style, so not really much to comment on in that respect. And of course, you know, you are playing at low settings for a reason, and that reason is just to make sure that you're giving yourself the best possible FPS advantage. So sitting right around 400 on our average, does seem like our CPU utilization is starting to drop into a more normal territory now. But definitely, you know, not that it's much of a question. Just like any competitive title, these titles are really meant to run on as much hardware as possible to make them as accessible as possible to as many people as possible. So a 5070 Ti being a nearly, you know, worst case scenario, like the card that I have being like a $1,000 GPU, you know, definitely it should be and is in this case overkill to run this particular title. So sitting right around 400. Let's see if we can get into a bit of combat here. Nice, okay. I don't really know, you know, what the higher refresh rate end of 1440p monitors are out there. I feel like I've heard a lot more about super high refresh rate 1080p monitors, but hey, if you have, you know, a 500 hertz 1440p monitor, this will populate it completely and look really great while doing it, which is nice that we can do this too at native resolution, just given the fact that this game is a bit lacking when it comes to the upscaling options. There is DLSS, however, does not use the latest model, and there's no FSR, so yeah, Fortnite seems to be, you know, given the fact that it's obviously Epic's main game, seems to be a, you know, real benchmark for the Unreal Engine in general. So they are seemingly pushing that that TSR. That would really be your option if you wanted to get even higher than this. But yeah, native 1440p, the game looks incredibly responsive, great frame times, which is not something that you really want to take for granted, especially in a game like Fortnite. Typically there are quite a bit of stutters, but definitely real solid experience here. Not that it's super surprising, but just over 400 FPS. All right, next up here we have Marvel Rivals. This is another one of those competitive titles, so I'm listening to the people, and I'll be playing here 1440p on low settings. So we're native resolution TAAU, that's just TAA. The U is for upscaling. However, as you can see, our render scale is set to 100, so there is no upscaling taking place. This is just pure, flat, cheapest anti-aliasing 1440p at low settings here. So definitely a competitive like test here. Now, as we kind of sit in our pregame lobby here, I will say, you know, while some games low settings looks terrible, this game, in my opinion, looks really great even on low settings. So really low settings, competitive title, I understand why people go for it, but especially on this title, I think that there's really not a great reason to play at least lower settings, if not the lowest possible settings. You know, the game still looks great here, and you know, kind of has that cartoon art style, much like Fortnite, but it seems like even on low settings, this game seems to render its assets a little cleaner than a game like Fortnite. But we are getting lower FPS than we were on Fortnite, so around 200, you know, this is, in my opinion, certainly a acceptable type FPS, really solid. And more importantly, for a competitive title like this, is the fact that not only are we getting high FPS, we are also getting consistent frame time. So sitting at around 200 on our FPS is certainly nice to have, but what's much more important is the fact that our 1% lows are so respectable, just sitting right around 140. So playing a few more minutes here, it looks like we're averaging out right around 200, and our 1% lows have pretty much stayed the same around 140. So definitely really solid experience here, competitive like FPS, and yeah, it's completely smooth frame times, and everything is working really well. So I would definitely say this is definitely another pass for the card, being a 1440p card, getting not only 60, but here on these competitive settings, getting a real competitive like FPS. And last up here, we have maybe the most demanding game that we're going to be checking out, Monster Hunter Wilds. So we are playing here at 1440p borderless window. There's no full screen option in this game. And we're going to be playing here, let's try the Ultra preset, which actually by default enables DLSS. We do have to come in here and manually disable it. But this is using, we just want to use TAA here for anti-aliasing. So the highest settings aside from ray tracing here at native 1440p. And while this game is certainly demanding, it seems as though this is within its capabilities. It may be a bit, you know, up to each person, just whether or not they would consider this to be a place where they'd want to play at. I mean, for me, while this is a multiplayer game, it's not a competitive multiplayer game, and all the timings that you have to deal with here are relatively simple enough that you can do all your counters, dodges, things like that, you know, and 80 FPS is more than enough to do that. This is also with that highest resolution, the optional texture pack that you actually have to install on the PC. It doesn't come with the game by default, which is why you can see our video memory is so high, hovering right around 14 gigabytes. But really, in my opinion, it's definitely worth having that extra bit of video memory. A lot of what makes this game look good and at the same time look not so good is just poor quality textures. And I'm definitely showing, and it's probably obvious that I have not played this game in quite some time, but as you can see, 75 FPS average here at 1440p. Ultra settings, the only thing we're leaving off is ray tracing at native resolution here. Incredibly impressive performance. So while I kind of thought that this game might be the one that would give us the most trouble, it turns out that really is handling it just fine. And I guess the game that gave us the most trouble was really that Oblivion Remaster with the settings that we were trying. But yeah, this game is another definite pass here at 1440p. Absolutely okay. So that's been the 5070 Ti. Quite a bit of time since it's, you know, originally released, but I wanted to go back and take a more in-depth look, and 1440p absolutely crushes it. I think that this card has shown itself to be really good. 1440p, kind of the sweet spot where you can get a bit higher resolution than just base 1080p, but you're not in the space where you're asking the card to generate 4K, where you may be met with some, you know, worse performance, obviously. So absolutely pass. Great 1440p option. The only thing that's not so great about it is just that price tag. But if you have the card, or if you're looking at the card and you can afford it, or you already did afford it, then you're going to be having a great time. All right, guys, thanks so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.